the worst punishment that a human being can have is to be isolated. You actually see fractures in people's psyches if they're isolated long enough, which I cannot believe is true, but does seem to be actually true. Even people in solitary confinement in prison would rather be around murderists, rapists, than to be completely isolated. Legitimately, that just seems shocking to me. So what is it about isolation? What's going on in the brain? That would actually be really interesting. And then in this time period, I think that the pet thing is huge. Fostering, for anybody that didn't hear the distinction between adopting and fostering. Fostering would be a temporary placement. Of course, if you end up falling in love with your dogs as much as I love mine, then maybe it does become a permanent home. But that's really interesting. Are there things beyond that we can do to get out of that? So just to recap, isolation, what's going on in the brain, and then beyond pets, is there anything that we can do to feel more connected over the internet? I don't know, anything.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned solitary confinement, because to really kind of torture, and I really feel like it's torture, for solitary confinement to work, to fracture people's psyche, they can't have any contact, right? So they try to, talk to people through the cells and all this. It's just like complete silence. They have to be with themselves. So in the brain, I don't know all of the specific ins and outs of that. I'm not sure that people have done fMRI studies with people who have been in solitary confinement. But what I can say is it's pretty clear that, as you're pointing out, that social isolation is really challenging. The nice thing here is we have this double-edged sword called the internet. And so on one hand, it can spread social contagion in a negative way. On another hand, it can spread social Purell, so to speak, or brain sanitizer in a positive way. So we can stay connected with others through texting each other, calling each other on the phone, getting on Skype like we're doing, and just having these face-to-face interactions. And I think the face-to-face is really key here. There's something really different about having a conversation with somebody on the phone than having it with them face-to-face. A lot of that probably has to do with most communication actually happens non-verbally. You're nodding your head right now. So you've just communicated with me non-verbally. Right now you're smiling. So all this stuff. So the fact that we've got Skype and Zoom and all these teleconferencing and video conferencing pieces is really helpful. I actually run a live group every week for the people using our apps, and we use Zoom to video conference, and it's really connecting. People connect from all over the world, and to be able to answer questions and interact with people literally face to face, even if they're in Europe or in Australia or whatever, is really, really helpful.
Yeah, so I've always been shocked. When my wife and I first got together, obviously boyfriend and girlfriend at the time, she was living in London, I was here in LA, and all we had was phone call and email, and this is in the days of long distance, and I was poor. So doing phone calls we did it rarely, so it was mostly email. And when Skype and video calls came out, I was like, I can't believe how impactful this is. It makes a huge difference if I'm able to see her or anybody for that matter, or just hear them. It's really interesting. Have you done VR with other people?
I have not, but I would.
Dude,
now you're piquing my curiosity.
Dude, I'm telling you right now, do it. It is crazy. So I did a version with just like a Samsung phone, so it was really low quality, but it was filming, I think, one of the Cirque du Soleil. And so there was this character from and they start really far away in the background, and they just keep walking closer and closer and closer to the camera until you literally feel like you need to back up because the sense of presence is so real. I was really surprised by how impactful that was. I think that's a really good piece of advice for people, is just, if you've got somebody that you can video with, do it. I'm going to ask you a curveball question. So let's say that somebody unfortunately finds himself in this position. They're a sort of social isolationist. Because they're bumping into people all the time, they don't even think about it. So they don't have a network of friends. They don't have somebody that they can call and hang out with on a video call. Does reading help?
That's a great question. Thank you for the curveball. Let's see how I do. So there, I would say if we can connect with the characters in the book, like if it's a really good novel, there's a feeling of connection there where it's like, and I don't know about you, but when I read a really good book, it feels pretty darn good. So that's the first thing I would say is, if you're reading a book, don't read a book about COVID-19 because there probably isn't one because nobody's written the book yet. But I would say read a really good book where you can really relate to the characters. And in that sense, we're going to start to fire off these brain systems that are around, really around like being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I would guess that absolutely can foster connection as well. But it's an experiment that people can try for themselves.
Yeah, it's one that, so I was thinking about this, like I've often thought about, because I don't feel compelled to be around people, which I think would surprise people, but I find, especially at, I don't know, call it the last 10 or 15 years of my life, I have felt very introverted, which wasn't necessarily true when I was growing up. I definitely would have identified as an extrovert as a kid. But as I got older, I found myself retreating more and more into my imagination. And so I thought, like, would I really like break if I were isolated long enough? And I don't know why, but like thought, what if I were like Tom Hanks in, I'm blanking on the movie.
Lost?
No, where he is
The Island?
Lost on the Desert Island. We are both blanking on the name of this right now. I cannot believe it. I've seen this movie so many times. It's so good. But anyway, he's on the desert island by himself. And would I, over time, break? Would I be able to talk to an inanimate object or something like that? And I thought, I really feel like I would. Because when I'm reading a book, I get so immersed in that world. And it really makes me want to know why isolation is so hard. Is it what you're talking about? Is it projecting yourself into somebody else's shoes? What are the mechanisms? Is it the emotional change? Because there are things from the outside that are taking you on this emotional roller coaster because you're getting input from the outside. I don't know. But for me, reading books, even more, even though I am definitely a movie guy over books, I would say reading has an intimacy that nothing else has. And so the good news is, even if you don't have books in your house, if you have an internet connection, you'd be able to get into a book. And I have a feeling, at least in the short term, that it would be a pretty viable way to salve whatever that pain is that's created through isolation, which is my big concern. So when I think about like what's going to freak people out, and this admittedly is probably just a blindness that I have, I don't get freaked out by the disease itself. Even though we don't know a lot about it, there just seems way too much data. Like I would say most people probably peg it at 1 to 1.5% fatality rate. You see some people saying even lower, even if it was insane and it was 5%, which it is not. But even if it was, it's 95% survival rate, right? So that one doesn't freak me out. But the thought of people having to isolate themselves, the thought of like the economic disaster that could happen from that's where I worry about people really beginning to wind themselves up, as you're saying, and having a hard time. And so going back to that pleasure loop of having some way to emotionally connect with something as a way to lower that, books seem like the sort of great equalizer. Absolutely.
And I think there's one other piece that we can even add to that. And I love your idea about books. I hadn't thought about that. It's brilliant. This fear of the future, anxiety is about fear of the future. And so if we think about, you brought up a couple of things like, oh, what about economic collapse? What about this? And our minds spiral out of control, right? They wind up more and more and more the more out into the future we get because the less certainty we have. Mm-hmm. So the idea there comes, I learned so much from my patients, one day at a time, right? If we notice that our mind's spiraling out, say, hey, take a deep breath. Ground yourself in your experience, use a short mindfulness practice, let your prefrontal cortex come back online and say, hey, do I need to worry about 6 months right now? I don't know what 6 months are going to look like. Let's start with today. And if today even seems overwhelming, let's start with what needs to happen this next hour. So we can take it, or this next minute, or this next moment, right? So we can take it moment by moment, and that will help us stay grounded in actionable stuff because we have accurate information for this moment. Like, do I need to eat something? Do I need to drink something? Do I need to relax? Do I need to cuddle my pet? What do I need right now? We know that. And we can say, okay, let's take it this moment. Let's take it this hour. Let's take it today. And then we'll worry about tomorrow, or not worry about tomorrow. We'll plan for tomorrow as tomorrow comes.